sort of natural thing to imagine what might be different about the future, if anything. I think one of the themes is, do ethics really change, or are they in some ways eternal? We can be absolutely clear that the scientific questions that we have to consider change. The implications of the new technologies over the last century have given us a steady stream of things to consider. How shall we incorporate these new technologies into human use in a way that is ethical, and by ethical we mean fair, good, reasonable, with eyes wide open, those sorts of things. So today I was hoping maybe to give you a chance. I recognize that the first ethics talk, I had you all, we went around the table and each of you presented some of the issues that have been on your mind. I'd like to make sure that we have a chance to address those, at least to some degree, in our general conversation. And so hopefully today there might be time for that. I haven't planned to talk at you for an hour, more like half an hour, and and then hopefully open it up for discussion. So I just want to go over a bit of this book. I don't know to what degree you've had a chance to look at it. It's the textbook for the course, The State of the Future. Now, is this still the latest one?
Yeah. I don't know what happened, but they seem sort of stuck on this one that we've been using for a while. They haven't come up with a new one yet.
Yeah. So I wanted to, I think it's good. I mean, it's a good book overall. Just looking through it again, I think the imaginings of what future scenarios might look like, I find quite interesting. There's a part where they act like it's 2050 and they're recounting the history of the last 30 years and the challenges that people faced through the 20s and 30s. I think one of the things about ethics for the future is the requirement for imagination. That we really need to, as well as we can, imagine what such a future might be like. Obviously there's no real evidence, and it takes some skill to figure out what can we reasonably anticipate. And then the idea is that the ethical challenges that we might foresee, it would be nice to have extensive discussions about them in advance, so that when we arrive at those times, they're not brand new, that we have some kind of societal understanding. So I just wanted to start with this one chapter. I sort of looking through the chapters. There are some that are worthwhile, and I think I might like to at a future lecture go through some of the health ones. But this is part 15, where they talk about global ethics. So I just wanted to suggest, or to introduce the concept. What does it mean to have global ethics, a worldwide ethic, in a world in particular where we probably increasingly recognize not only diversity of culture and language, but we respect the diversity of culture and language, much more so now than I think would have been the case decades ago, when we still probably had a state of competing universalistic ideologies, people who thought they were in possession of sort of universal truths or universal ways of being, and seeing the inevitable clash of cultures where one would eventually win out. When you look at the visions of some traditional religions, the utopian vision of those are that eventually everybody in the world will come to see some sort of light, and by implication live in a similar way. That's starkly contrasted with our modern sensibilities, our recognition of the value in diversity. And in that context, a future where all of us are the same in some way it looks very dystopian. We, I think, particularly value the individual differences that we bring. We would see it as a catastrophe of some type if those were to dissolve. So trying to find a global ethic, some fundamental idea that can usefully guide us is an ongoing challenge. So it's not a very long chapter. I just wanted to quickly go through some of the points, and then we'll go back to discussion of it. So just this is, you can see it's on page 47 of the document, which is I think about 150 pages. So I just wanted to call your attention to what's written there, that since all algorithms are not ethically neutral, the future of ethics will in part influenced by auditing ethical assumptions in software. So ethical assumptions. So these are the things that maybe don't come to mind when we first think about building software that will make ethical decisions. I know that one of you expressed an interest in how are we going to build in automatic cars or those sorts of things. The decision-making algorithms or artificial intelligences that are going to decide in the moment of disaster which way to swerve. So in the case of a car, are we going to, if this self-driving car has to slam on the brakes or has to swerve to avoid, getting smushed in some kind of accident, do they turn left or do they turn right based on what they see? This scenario that, it's hard to imagine that, the cameras or the detectors on the car or elsewhere are going to evaluate who is where. Are they going to see pedestrians on the sidewalk? Are they going to decide that, rather than swerve into the crowd, try to swerve into another vehicle where you might just have one person? But you can see how that, however the algorithm is programmed, which somebody has to do, that there are ethical assumptions built in about value, about. So I think a lot of what we're trying to do in looking at the ethics is sometimes unmasking those assumptions that aren't instantly obvious. What are we talking about? And then some of those would be the equivalent of what I've described as the eternal questions of ethics, which are relevant in all of these discussions, like what really is the essence of human life? Are we just made to be happy? Are we made to progress technologically for some particular purpose? Is it that technological progress that will empower us to ultimately save ourselves? Are we moving forward simply for the sake of progress? So all of these fundamental questions are what we're talking about in identifying the ethical assumptions that underlie our specific decisions. So I just wanted to call your attention, like I said at the beginning, to this term called global ethics. And it's one that's been out there very much like the idea of human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's certainly nice ideas with some concrete presence in the world, but still not utter clarity about what we're to do with those concepts or how we're to integrate them into our day-to-day living. So just to think, well, what is a global ethic, or a global bioethic in the case of science and technology? Just a little farther down the chapter, however, corporate behavior can be less ethical in lower income countries. For example, waste disposal and cigarette advertising. Just an example that some of the things we've done in this part of the world, that are certainly ethical decisions related to a type of greater good. So cigarette advertising would be a good example, a decision that is probably not unreasonable to stop the promotion of this activity that is widespread, bless you, gets loads of people addicted and leads to their early death. I heard it was the state of Hawaii. Somebody in Hawaii a couple days ago in the news apparently wants to revive the idea that's been around that we really ought to just make smoking illegal. We should just ban it. The arguments that that somehow it's we ought to be free to do things, that it's an expression of our liberty, ought to be overruled. And we know that there's probably some good reasons for that, but in the real world, how would such a thing unfold? It wouldn't be so easy. It would lead to all sorts of other problems, like the creation of a huge black market. You're not going to change people or eliminate demand. So I think just in that point where we maybe have a sensibility of the public ethic that exists around here, where I think most people see a whole bunch of reasonableness in limiting unfettered tobacco advertising. But probably most people think it might be going a little too far to just ban it outright. Out of the spirit, it's bad for you. We know that human beings are a little bit weak, especially when they're addicted. So we're going to do you the favor, creating a law that's going to help you resist these urges. And that's really what it comes from. But ethics is always about trying to find the right amount of motivation to help people. And in this, I would remind you of the words I think I probably introduced it a few weeks ago. Autonomy and heteronomy. So autonomy, self-law, auto nomos. Heteronomy, hetero means other. And so heteronomy is when the law, the things that make us decide what to do, come from another. Somebody telling us what to do, whether that's a policeman or a parent or someone. The idea that humans, in order to be encouraged to do the right thing, really need to feel the weight of somebody looking down on them, telling them. And then we're also enamored by this idea of autonomy. Wouldn't it be nice if we humans don't need to be told what to do, but generate the sensibility and the will to do it on our own? So that's the what we love about autonomy, that we're self-driven. So, in my opinion, the impulse of the Hawaii legislator who says, let's just ban it, which in this case, the story was that they're going to raise the age to buy tobacco to 100, which I assume was in order to get around some federal law or something. You can't just ban it, but you can raise your age from 21 to 100, which, I don't know, for middle-aged guys like me, we never get asked for ID. I probably still have trouble saying that I'm 100. But anyway, so corporate advanced marketing methods that bypass consumers' deliberative capacities. So those are pretty loaded words. Basically saying that the salesmen and the marketers that have access to our senses and brains are so good at it that they are able to make us think we want what we don't really. They bypass our deliberative capacities. And if you read a lot about the problems of excessive influence online, whether it's through social media or whatnot, this is part of what they're talking about, that marketers and certain experts have a way of tapping into our innermost feelings, especially when they know these things about us, like all of the websites we visited for the last year and a bunch of the things we've accessed, which give them a sense of who we are and what we like and what we don't like, and enable them to manipulate our feelings in some way. So I think that's what they mean by bypassing our deliberative capacities. And so in some ways, I think ethics education in the university, in high schools and elsewhere, has certainly got to be aimed on that part of ethics which is involved with self-awareness. You know, to what degree are you, like most human beings, able to be easily influenced by things that you see? That's why a big part of modern health ethics is involve exercises in self-awareness. Where do you come from? Where have you gotten your values? How have those evolved, especially since you've become a thinking adult, which usually happens somewhere between age 15 and 30. By that I just mean awareness of other possibilities of ways of being and ways of thinking. And a pretty common experience for undergraduate students, at the end of their first few years, age 20, 21, 22, then the main thing I recognize is just how much knowledge is out there and how little a slice of this pie that I have. And that's the main thing that I've learned. And I think a lot of us as teenagers might not have appreciated that, and which is why at age 16 we're all sure that our parents are pretty stupid and we know a lot more than them. And, I don't know to what degree that's true. I know that in the eyes of my kids, you guys I'm sure think a lot more of me than the kids. So just a few more things that I want you to think about. Towards the end, I talked about public morality. And again, the sense of what is right and wrong, good and bad in the public, has historically been based on religious metaphysics. That would mean ways of seeing the world through the lenses of traditional religions. And I think most of us would accept that the grip of those religions in this part of the world is a lot less than it probably used to be, but that whatever we've built, it's on the foundations of a religious background, and that they still affect us. A sense of the divine, as characterized by major world religions. And that it's challenged daily by a growing secularism. So in this sense, I'd like you to understand, what is secularism? This move away from traditional religion. But I think the real key thing for everybody to consider, especially in universities, is that whether one is a devout secularist or devout according to a traditional religion or to something in between, we recognize these days that all of us make these faith commitments based on fundamental uncertainty of what is absolutely ultimately real. So even if you're a committed scientist and you think that the methods and ways of science can replace some of the things that religion used to provide, when you really think about it, you have to recognize that there is no actual basis for making that leap. You sort of decide that I'm going to choose to build my worldview around this reality. And I think what everybody, secularist, religionist, and everyone in between, they really talk about it, could agree on, it would be the fundamental mysteries of existence, which I spoke about. None of us can say with certainty what's beyond the edge of our universe. None of us can say with certainty what's going on inside the subatomic particles that we've identified. And that within such spaces is room for huge mystery that none of us can really claim to know about. And I think that sense of shared mystery on some level might be the beginning of what could be a truly global ethic. What can we actually agree on? And I'd say it might be a tall order to ask, especially some of the traditional religions, whether for the name of global harmony, for the name of ultimately all of us getting together a little bit better, are you able to pull back a little bit on your ultimate truth claims? And if pushed, there isn't any religion that covers the whole gamut. Even people who really feel the presence of a divine creator that has being. There are still the questions, you know, and what happened before that creator, you know, what happened after. Whenever we humans are considering things that are impossible to grasp rationally, like the infinite, there's just no rational way to get your head around it. And in some ways, I think one of the the keys to wisdom in the future world of a global ethic is just that kernel of humility, that none of us can possibly have the whole truth, which hopefully is linked to an idea that revelation and wisdom, at least theoretically, could come through different sources, which, in some ways we have to lay the foundation for people getting along with each other, even those people who really are committed to a single historical idea. And that's the challenge. It's easy for liberal, free-thinking people who are around a university, most people have that openness, to say such things, but we really have to account for those people who are still steeped in a particular tradition. They don't, by lack of education or just lack of diversity, have had a chance to think about the possibility of other ways of thinking. In some ways, that's a luxury that happens to people who arrive at universities. So just going through that text a little bit more, that they're unsure about the moral basis for decision making. Unfortunately, religions and ideologies that claim moral superiority, and that's a tough thing. In some ways, every ideology or way of being, it doesn't need to claim moral superiority, but it should think highly of itself. It should think of itself as worthwhile, and at least adequate or good for those followers. It's not easy to say that I follow this or that way of being or thinking, just because it happens to be there. But hopefully you've decided that it is good or better for you in some way, which implies a sense of being superior. And it's that kernel of doubt that I think is key to that everybody ought to carry. And maybe that's still a challenge. There's a lot of people out there who have been taught to fight away the moment of doubt. When what you're told about how the world or what's expected of you, because it's logical or because it's written in a particular book. We know that people who are too committed to such ideas become capable of I guess maybe violence against the other in the name of that idea. So when we think about a global ethic and what might unify us, I do worry about what in another slide I call the problems of absolutism and universalism. That those two things combined, if you think that your fundamental idea is absolutely true, no exceptions, and that it's universal, that it applies to everybody, that's the seed for an ideology that leads people to think, well, we gotta just conquer the whole world and make them behave this way because it's the correct thing to do. And while in theory, there may be such a correct thing, we humans should admit to ourselves that we don't know exactly what that is, and it's not worth killing each other over it. I think people have been trying to convince others of that for millennia. And the moral superiority that give rise to the we-they splits that are being played out in conflicts around the world. The us and them. So I don't know about you, but I get the sense that the news of the day, I'm thinking in recent years, the last few years, but even in particular in the last few weeks, this tendency to divide people, we or they, good or bad. And I'm thinking of some of the newspaper stories I've read about celebrities behaving badly. So if a celebrity goes on and says that 20 years ago, he had this thought that he wanted to do harm to somebody else. So in this case, it's an actor that says a friend of his was a victim of violence, and he felt that he wanted to go and take revenge against somebody who's in the same ethnic racial group as the perpetrator of this. And like so many, is being, having a very tough time in the media by those who say that him sharing this expression indicates clearly a fundamental racism. That means he doesn't deserve anybody's respect, that his movies should be on blacklists, and that he, and here's the key, appears to be a fundamentally evil person because of what he's shared. And so that's where I say we've got this we-they split, this idea of identifying who are the good people and who are the bad people. When, if you cut to the chase and really think about the capacities of every human being, it's obvious that all of us have the possibility for good and the possibility for evil. And this idea that when somebody goes and shares this idea that I had this week 20 years ago where I was filled with rage and ready to, to act in what was obviously an unreasonable, racist-driven fit, rather than us trying to say, oh, we thought you were on the good side, but it turns out you're on the evil side. That's the danger, and that's one of the things we see going on in public discussions, this black and white. Are they good or are they bad? And then my sense, same thing about politicians. So there's a whole bunch of examples of politicians where somebody has dug up something from their past, which appears to indicate that they might be misbehaving or insensitive or racist, because of what a particular picture implies. But it's the same thinking that our public discourse has turned to this attempt to identify good and evil as if those are permanent labels. And I'm sure you've all seen with the rise of what the internet does in the last 5 years, this ability to mob people. People who tie into the story start jumping on, only exacerbating this sense of good, evil. And then I find it pretty interesting that if the person is associated with a company, or a government, then you get all these other people weighing in saying, they must resign, or they must remove themselves from public office. And again, my sense when I hear that, what I would call the over-righteous indignation, where people publicly say, look at that bad person, what a terrible thing they did 20 or 30 years ago. If you really looked at any human being and went through their list, not only of deeds, but thoughts, there's nobody in the world that would pass. All of us have had moments of those thoughts where we're considering things. So, as we try to talk about what is a global ethic, or what is an ethic that might unite us, I think it's important for you to have your eyes open to the human tendency to see things as dual, good or bad. It's just never that simple. And I guess I'm a big fan of the idea of, there but for the grace of God go I, that for a lot of things that this could have happened to us. And that what it reveals is the human condition. That if we want to grapple with ethics in the real world, it can't be that anybody who's had a moment of irrational anger is excluded. It should be that all human beings, in the wake of tragedy or shock, as they process that, may well go through irrational thoughts, emotional thoughts, including this idea of revenge, which in most cases is a sort of a misguided sense of justice. You know, the actor certainly would not have found justice if he'd gotten what he was looking for, you know, in those days where he's walking around angry. But to deny that human beings all feel angry at times, that they struggle with what to do with their outrage, that's a universal human condition. So just moving down, you know, we have to be very careful about moral superiority and we-they splits. Then the next paragraph, just some real questions. Is it ethical to clone ourselves? Bring dinosaurs back to life? You know, these are some of the real questions. I can imagine that, you know, idea of extinct animals, dinosaurs, mammoths, whatever they may be. You know, I mean, we've seen the movie. You know, there's a little bit of surviving genetic material that's 100 million years old. One of these years we'll be able to fiddle with it and potentially activate it, bring it back to life. You know, in the movie, it doesn't go so well. But you know, I think maybe more relevant are these ideas of synthetic biology. You know, that in the lab, in the medical world, there are going to be a lot of good ideas in the next decades of biological organisms that we might create for the purpose of fighting disease or curing us or helping us. And as we try to figure out whether it's a good idea to proceed with these things, we will always do these sorts of calculations. What are the risks? What are the benefits? And like I said, there's the danger of miscalculating, you know, especially if the risk of some new synthetic biological organism was completely unforeseen, you know, and it ends up being the equivalent of, you know, the flu virus for which nobody has any immunity. Again, it's just hard to know how much to heed the famous dystopian movies that I guess you guys, as the years go by, are less and less likely to have seen. But have any of you not seen The Matrix? Or at least heard about it? So I don't know, maybe it's just my age that I'm dominated by the dystopian vision of the Matrix and the Terminator, both of which involve the intelligent machines eventually figuring out that humans are the enemy. You know, and I think one of the themes of the course is that a realistic fear? And I think I'm persuaded that probably isn't quite as realistic as the scriptwriters would have had us believe. So part of what we're talking about is in the next slide, anticipatory ethical systems. What is a new ethic for the future, for future technologies, basically we're anticipating. And I'm pretty sure that my general thesis is that the fundamentals of ethics, you know, however we define those, are not going to change. At least in the short-term future, or the relatively short-term, meaning maybe a century, we human beings will still be fundamentally human beings, and I don't think that we have to look at a radically new ethic. We have to look at what we've learned about optimizing human interpersonal behavior and assume that those principles will continue. You know, and then the risks, you know, the possibility of individuals producing weapons of mass destruction, and you know, it's pretty easy to imagine that we're going to go through this phase where individuals really could wield unimaginable power with technological interventions, and there'll be an impulse that the only way to fight against that is to drastically reduce people's privacy, you know, full surveillance systems. You know, and just to think about the ethics of that, the justification for a full surveillance system would be the public good and public safety. You know, establishment that there might be individuals out there who are not just planning, your so-called disaster or terrorist attack, but, something really bad. And whether those threats actually exist or not, one can see that the importation of a surveillance culture will not be that hard to justify if the threats of these ideas are here. And then the real tough question, would it end up being good if we had full surveillance? I can imagine all sorts of radical goods that could happen, in particular, the security of each individual. The violent crimes that we, really don't like, that tend to happen behind closed doors where people dominate each other. If in the surveillance culture, it's going to be a lot harder for those things to happen. So that could certainly be seen as a good, that we all walk around in a state of protection. That if we become victims of violence, that some overseer is going to see that and prevent it. And more likely, people knowing that someone's watching, it's just not going to happen. But at what cost? And that brings us back to one of these themes that, I come back to a lot, which is who are you going to trust in this world and in the future world? Is it conceivable that we can trust the people watching the surveillance? And there's a good reason to think that the surveillance will initially be watched by AI, artificially intelligent machines, who will be programmed to pick out certain types of behavior. When they see it, to escalate it, I assume, to some human who could then do something. Anyway, these are no doubt going to be some of the core questions over, if your working lives are more or less the next 40 years. I suspect that they'll be lingering for much of that. So then just wanted to call your attention to this list, the actions to address Global Challenge 15, which in this case is about a global ethic and the need to deliver one. And you can just sort of read that list of things they think would be a good idea. Create audit procedures to expose ethical assumptions in algorithms. I think it goes without saying that it would be nice to have open conversations about what those ethical assumptions are. They certainly shouldn't be hidden from people. Establish an international system to deter cyber and information warfare. Again, brings us back to these questions of autonomy and heteronomy. To what degree are we going to be able to educate human beings to trust that their autonomous decisions are going to lead to the right thing? Or do we think there's never going to be any way that we can trust human beings? We need to continue to, in a way, threaten them with punishment or consequence, meaning we need a heteronomous system because we can't trust people to autonomously do the right thing all the time. And then enforce measures to reduce corruption. Major connection between corruption and trust. We live in a country that I would say is relatively free of corruption, meaning there is not an expectation when you access public services, a doctor or a healthcare worker or a plumber, that in order to get good service, you need to slip them $100 or that that it's all about connections and whatnot. There are still many parts of the world where corruption is expected. That people who achieve a certain level of power, just the way things are, that they would then expect to have people offer them bribes and to wield that political power, because that's the way things have always been. So reducing corruption is a tall order, but hopefully one that's necessary. And maybe I'm naive in thinking that we're doing a pretty good job in North America. But I still think that this idea that the expectation of corrupt systems is not there, and we should actually really celebrate what kind of human achievement that is, that most of our public services don't expect that kickback or whatnot. The next couple are really interesting. Require civics and ethics in all forms of education, focusing on making behavior match the values people say they believe in. So all sorts of questions there. What does it mean to teach ethics and civics? How to be civil to each other in classrooms. And I'm not sure if they're talking about to elementary or high school students. I'm not sure that you get your sense of right or wrong or how you should behave by a teacher telling you that. It's certainly something that should be discussed, but I'm not absolutely sure that simply teaching people ethics and civics is going to solve the problem. The interesting part of the sentence where they would like people to behave the way in a way that matches their values, implying that a lot of us are driven to behave in other ways. And I think that that's a valuable insight, that there's a distinction between what we know to be true and then what we actually do. And what we actually do when we know that it maybe isn't the best thing is almost always justified by something like, well, other people are doing it. And that, especially in healthcare and scientific research, where an individual researcher has to decide, am I really going to follow all the rules? Or am I going to take a chance at that unbelievable breakthrough by doing some things I'm not supposed to do? Which if they pay off, I'm going to have this incredible breakthrough. So the scientist who decides to implant the DNA in embryos, have them born, no doubt was thinking, well, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but if I succeed in doing it, everyone's going to clap and celebrate what a wonderful achievement. So clearly he was a bit misguided. From what I've read about it, he didn't display a lot of insight into why simply going ahead and manipulating genes in a baby that's now going to be grown is so dangerous. So there's been quite an outcry against it, which is good. A lot of the challenge of ethics is to get us to do what we know to be right and not something else. This next one, promote parental guidance to establish a sense of values. Again, it's, we know that people in families that have parents present and teaching and role modeling, that such children will benefit big time. I think it's a pretty tall order to say, everybody's going to have good parents and then everything will be fine. It's hard to make good parents on their own or through the schools. But at the same time, our behavior is largely guided by those people that we're spending so much time with over our first 10 years. Develop new social contracts between governments and citizen rights. I just want to introduce you to the idea of the social contract, which you might hear discussed sometimes in liberal societies, that there's this social contract between the people and the governing authorities. So that it's not an actual contract that people have sat down and negotiated. It's an implicit contract, that governments and authorities will do their best for the people and the public and individuals, and in return, the citizens will be expected to behave in a certain way, and it's sort of a give and take. So the social contract is the implicit arrangement between the people in society and its government. All right, so have a look at that chapter. I don't. It certainly raises more questions than it answers, but I think it's worth looking at. So This is just now back to the slides. That's the title of the article. That's the list I just read from. So now, maybe I'll just stop there. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, so we were kind of talking about things like having the surveillance state and having oversight and problems like corruption and how that might solve that if AI is overlooking it. However, I was kind of wondering what your perspective on how wealth inequality plays into this, since often the more wealthy people receive technology first and then could kind of be the ones to set that up. So as we transition to like a state or a condition where AI is like the overseer, as you said, how do you think that will kind of happen given the inequalities we see in the current world?
Well, it's very hard to predict. I think we need to start with acknowledging inequalities, the gap between the wealthy and the unwealthy, an understanding of justice, both small j justice, little bits of fairness between people, and then a general sense of justice in the world. And the obvious experience that anybody paying attention over the last 30 years has seen is that gap has increased big time. And so sometimes you might hear about the 1%. It isn't the 1%. It's the 0.001%. You hear statistics like that the top 10 richest people in the world basically have the same wealth as half the world. And things like that. But more importantly, an understanding of the structures that have caused that, how it's defended, and where it's ultimately leading. So it becomes absolutely relevant to these discussions. Who's going to wield the technology? Who's going to make the decision about whether we go to a surveillance state or not? Is it going to be driven by economic considerations, people who see an opportunity to make money? If I'm going to a surveillance state and I'm in the mini camera making business, just out of a pure desire to have a really good business, I might be pushing the surveillance state so I can sell 100,000 cameras to the government. But I think when we look about a global ethic, inequality is one of the major themes we need to deal with. Both as a principle, what does it mean to fairness and equity and equality among people? How important is that? How is it supposed to happen? I think that some of the debate is encoded into political discussions. So those political parties that say we need a much larger middle class. We need a huge number to reduce the super wealthy, redistribute that among this sort of middle section, which creates a much larger group of empowered people with interests. So I don't know how experience in ethics is going to help me answer the question, how should we do this any better than you? Except to be aware, as one of the key questions that we ask about any technology is, how is this going to be distributed? Who's going to decide? And what's it going to do about this gap between rich and poor, which we can probably agree on some broad consensual level, ought to be narrowed. There ought to be fewer poor people, and isn't it ridiculous, the incredible wealth that some people have? How can we get that closer together?
So real quick, but are there any global agencies that are actually enforcing some sort of ethical standard onto researchers?
Well, there are absolutely standards on researchers. To some degree, they are by convention. The laws that would apply to them would be national or local laws. that in order for bits of research to proceed, and the most, that they need to go through a process of review. We know that's a pretty robust system in Canada and the US and Europe. If you talk to researchers, they'll, all of them will have stories about the ethics hurdle that they have to get past in putting together any research project, which is a combination of establishing that this scientific research has at least a chance of being scientifically valid based on prior work. And then that any subjects, animal or human, that are involved will be maximally protected and fully informed and those sorts of things. What we do know is that in countries that are maybe less developed in some ways, the structures that would protect people from research are not as established, which is why if you are a mad scientist looking for a place to do your research, maybe third world countries or islands are the place to go if you want to escape the regulatory environment. So we only, I think, really have laws in countries where there are such authorities. But along those lines, I do think it is the world of research ethics that is going to potentially play a major role in regulating how how we go forward in technological development. So just very quickly, the world of organized ethics, which is still relatively new, it could be divided into some different areas. And there's clinical ethics, which is a group of people that assist people in making decisions, in smoothing out apparent controversy or disagreement, in providing informal or semi-formal means of identifying and resolving disputes at the bedside, because we know that when you've got doctors and nurses caring for patients, tough questions come up. So that's clinical ethics. Research ethics is a whole other world. There are structures at every major university that bring together a group of people, largely with a multitude of talent around the table, some scientists that are going to understand the science, and then a community of peers. And so that's really the structure that is intended to decide whether research of all types can go forward reasonably. And that process, the idea of reviewing research, basically happened in the middle of the 20th century, in the recognition that left unchecked, loads of our physician/researchers are potentially going to attempt to do things that are either scientifically invalid or that are unreasonably dangerous to their research subjects. So I think we've done a pretty good job of putting up, at least a structure that attempts to assess the value of research. Any other thoughts, questions? All right, so I want to, in the first lecture, I didn't get to the last few slides, so just in the last little bit, I wanted to just say a little bit about these items. So integrating the lessons of history. When we think about a global ethic, an ethic for the future, it seems pretty obvious that that the ethics of our recent history, mainly the events that have made the news, that have been, the things that have oriented our sensibility, and that's where, in the 20th century, you talk about the Nazi physicians perpetrating unbelievably cruel experiments on hundreds and hundreds of prisoners. A recognition that you can't do research on prisoners, that's not reasonable at all. you know, combined with things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and, you know, certain LSD experiments that were done in Canada. You know, a whole bunch of research right through the 1950s and 60s that didn't see it as important that we protect people or ask people their consent, so a real innovation. So we need to integrate the lessons of history. You know, there's that philosopher, historian, Santayana, who put out that fairly famous idea, those who forget our history are doomed to repeat it. And I know almost every day I see what seems to be evidence of people forgetting history, you know, not recognizing what happened and why we believe what we do. That we need to do what we can to avoid foreseeable tragedy. And when I say foreseeable, you know, when we think about the mad scientist and the power of the future lone individual with sufficient knowledge and resources, just how much damage that one person could do. You know, how do we protect against that? You know, I don't know the answer to that. I suspect it has something to do with reducing human alienation. You know, that most of us are better off working with other people, whether, you know, family members, colleagues, you know, and not to be driven into this lone pursuit. You know, colleagues and trusted colleagues are a great thing, and you know, so maybe that's one way of protecting against future tragedy. You know, and then I think what I spoke about earlier is that an ethic of the future must be pluralistic. You know, there's no way around that. And by pluralistic, I mean fundamental, heartfelt respect in most people for the other. And you know, that is still a tall order for people who are steeped in traditions or ideologies where they think, you know, this is the one way. You know, it's often, I use the metaphor of, you know, the many paths up the mountain, as opposed to you know, there's only one path up this mountain. You know, and I guess one of my contentions is that an ethic for the future has to be the multi-path route. You know, and when I say that there's consensus, it is the sense that, you know, around much of the world, I think everybody values diversity. You know, we really see it as a tragedy when, you know, a small group of people, you know, grow extinct because, you know, they were so small, and we see it as a loss. When we hear that, you know, individual languages, you know, that we're losing, you know, languages of the world by, you know, many each year, I think we feel that as a loss. You know, a real sense that we're not headed towards a single way of thinking and a single way of being. That the future ultimately will have this diversity. You know, and that's again barring some revelation that, you know, there is always the possibility that one of the heroes of the world's great religions will come as promised and be there up in the sky and convince all of us that you know, that one of those stories really was true. Although most of us would probably have a fair bit of doubt about an image that appeared in the sky these days, because we would see it as trickery. You know, somebody's pulling one on us with a fancy new tool. So I don't want to speak too much about these except just to introduce them. Again, the concept of justice as a principle, you know, and when you're thinking to yourself, well, what do I want to know about ethics of the future? You know, I think I've told you in the first lecture what are some of the basic ethical principles, at least in health ethics or bioethics. We like to think, well, what do autonomous people want? How can we assess whether what they're considering is good or bad, potentially good or potentially harmful? You know, and then this concept of justice or fairness. You know, and I think we humans have a real innate sense of justice just by living in community. You know, I talked about the state of nature that we're in when we're little kids. You know, when you, as a 4-year-old running around, you're keenly aware of how big is your share compared to your other little buddies and your brother and sister. You know, his piece of pie was bigger than mine, let's be fair. And so it's on that basis that I think there is an innate sense of justice, as well as an acceptance in most people's heart of hearts that justice and fairness is probably the way to go rather than power and domination. You know, my piece of pie is bigger than yours, what are you gonna do about it? You know, that sort of idea that, you know, we know is part of the problem in the world. People like power, they like to exert power, they feel good in a way when they do it, but they know that that justice is also important.
In the example of the little kids though, if one kid has a bit more pie than the other, the one who has less pie will say, yeah, it's not fair. But then the kid who has more pie wouldn't say, no, it's not fair, you just eat the pie.
It depends a lot on the kid. You know, I think, you know, I've certainly seen the kid, you know, who, you know, for whatever reason, you know, understands the injustice, you know, and says, oh, you can have this bite of my pie to make it all even. You know, I don't know how they break down, but they exist.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think, you know, maybe they're the people that have a natural sense of empathy towards the other. And I suspect depends on a whole bunch of things, including who are your brothers and sisters and parents, and do you have a sense of having more than you need, or are you always fighting for your piece of the pie? You know, all of those things are going to affect people. Authenticity, again, this is a philosophical concept mainly from the 20th century, but I really think that it speaks to a genuineness when we talk about ethics in human communication as an attempt to build real bridges, that we long for authenticity, and we long for the exchange of you know, real, honest, trusting, heartfelt emotions, and we get a sense of, you know, I guess, a thrill of some type, or we like it when we've connected with other human beings in some way that is beyond the superficial. And so in some ways, I imagine authenticity becomes a relevant concept when we're thinking about how we relate to the super well-programmed robot, you know, who isn't yet AI, but is just a really good algorithm. And then the next step, the actual AI robot that has been unleashed, not just a series of algorithms, but has been programmed in a way that it will establish new connections in its own personality. You know, and one of the key questions is, will we humans be able to authentically relate to such beings, or not? So authentic relationship, you know, it's against domination, you know, it's against slavery. And I'm convinced that we humans, you know, I mentioned the other day, I think that a big part of human life is attempting to bridge that gulf between the isolation of you and your individual head and other human beings. That's what we always do. And that, you know, really good, smart robots that perfectly simulate what other human beings would say may be satisfying to some degree, but I think we humans know the difference between a real interaction and a simulation. You know, that, you know, so you could bring a robot to the bedside of an elderly person, and because they've got bad eyesight and bad hearing, you know, maybe they don't notice that it isn't a regular human being at first. And therefore, because they think they're interacting with a real person, you could say it's totally authentic for that person. But it's partly because of the deception. So I don't know, one of the ideas is that I think we humans will continue to know when we're interacting with another independent human being, you know, where there's all these other assumptions. Are we going to earn their respect? Are we going to connect with them in some way? And that if certain types of mad scientists or individuals surround themselves with artificial people who are programmed to prop them up and always tell them what they want to hear. And you can sort of imagine people retreating into that. I think ultimately we would, almost all of us, be totally unsatisfied because we long for authentic existence. A simulation is just a vacation from reality. And then you can, natural law, I won't get into it, but just this idea, really coming out of certain religious traditions that argue that some of the traditional divine principles, which people have said have been revealed in holy books, are in fact observable in the natural world. And you can derive the law of how people should treat each other from the natural world. You don't need, it isn't just pure revelation, because the divine said so in this book. And so natural law is an attempt to look at the world and define our obligations that way. And then dignity, just a concept of human worth or the worth of other entities, especially when we're thinking about AI. So what I think when we think about the ethics for the future, these are the things to consider. So the questions, what is, I'd like you to understand what is a slippery slope, meaning. Sometimes we know that taking one or two steps down a particular path is probably okay. But the slippery slope is the fear that over time, those steps change our sensibilities. So if you just think of the current medical assistance in dying, lots of argument about are we on a slippery slope or not. The slippery slope would be, well, today we say that certain people with life-limiting conditions who've really thought about it can request help in assisting in dying. People who fear the slippery slope would say, well, surely in the future that's going to expand. Now it's people who have to be close to death and conscious. There'll be other people who come and say, well, I'm not that close to death, but I'm suffering. And so the slippery slope would mean that we slowly expand these categories so that 200 years from now, we don't even recognize where we began, and we think it's just totally natural that you turn 60 and then you go file into the vaporizer, because that's what society has deemed as the length of life, and for the greater good, that's what you do. So a slippery slope is the slow erosion of values. And for any new technology, you've got to consider, is it possibly a step along a slope that has this danger of changing our sensibilities, so that what we think is totally ridiculous now, we don't think that. And when you imagine the surveillance state, the idea where the man has eyes and ears everywhere, you can see how the decisions we've made over the last 10 years might well be creeping towards that. And astoundingly, how much of it was voluntary, that all of us bought a cell phone, put it into our pocket, didn't disable the location device, and are in effect being tracked everywhere we go. Pretty remarkable when you think about it. I mentioned the precautionary principle, which I think is this idea that for some ideas where there is this remote possibility of total disaster, so that you do think about science, technology, whether it's nuclear stuff dealing with viruses or disease. If the chance of disaster is low but enormous, if it does happen, you've got to decide, does the precautionary principle have a role in saying that we shouldn't even approach that problem? And I think that maybe it ought to be applied. Just the status of eternal questions, who are we, what are we here for as human beings, those don't change. But again, I think those who who see the unrelenting march of progress to necessarily be leading to somewhere better. I mean, I hope that's true, but I'm not sure it necessarily is. And so it begs the question, how patient should we be? Is there any way to slow down progress? And it might be a moot question because it has a life of its own and we can't really slow it down. But underlying this are the questions of, well, what are we human beings here to do? You know, I think particularly when you look at the future of work in a world of abundance, one of the things about the future is that our amazing technologies will be able to do most of the labor. But it really calls into question, what are we human beings happy doing? What do we want to do? And are we here to be happy? Are we here to produce things? Are we here to interact? Those questions don't go away. And so that second last line where I say reasonable, provisional, cross-cultural, grand narratives, and I think that's, any ethical system is built on an understanding of the world, which tells a bit of a story. You know, this is where the world started, these are the creatures, here are human beings. And as we tell that story to ourselves, it frames where we can find room for new technologies. So I think maybe I'll stop there, just to give 5 minutes for discussion.
So have any of you started to read it in this book, The State of the Future? Or did the first slide come as kind of a shock that, holy smokes, what is this thing? Yeah, have you started to do that at all?
No, I think, I mean, unless somebody else has brought it up, you got it from Dr. Solis in the first email, welcome to the class.
Right.
You have both an executive summary version and the full version of this document.
You do, yeah.
And so, you'll have a look at it. I don't think it's what you call a comprehensive textbook, but it raises some of the issues.
And you can be a part of it in the future if you want. You know, you can sign up and help write parts and all sorts of things. You can have agency, you can do stuff, change the world for that book. And hopefully there'll be a new edition of it.
I'm curious, when you think of your home departments, you know, the classes that you take in your central programs, do you get a sense of what sorts of ethics rule that domain? You know, or, you know, if you're, I mean, most of you are in science programs. You know, do you hear more about justice or more about searching for profit? Does it depend who you're listening to?
I know for like vaccines, a big concept is risk versus benefit. And like if the benefit is really, really large.
So, you know, again, if I understand you correctly, people are talking about the risks and benefits of vaccines as if it's a tough question?
As a joke, but like in all seriousness, like there's like new vaccines as well, right? I mean, live vaccines, for example, even if they're attenuated, so inactivated, they can still get transmitted to people. And if this guy's like an anti-vaxxer, is it ethical that he inadvertently gets the vaccine, which like helps him or her, but they didn't agree to it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, in some ways, a lot of those questions are settled, I would hope. And you're right, there are good questions to be asked about, you know, new vaccines and stuff. You know, but some of the old standard vaccines, you know, if you just do a standard ethical calculation based on real mathematics and probabilities, there's everybody should be vaccinated. I think a super interesting question in ethics, and that idea of we need to learn from history going forward, is to really try to understand the thinking of all the anti-vaxxers they don't make that decision to not vaccinate their kids because they think it's irrational. They think that it is the most rational thing, all things considered, because they've been persuaded that there's a conspiracy in the vaccine production world. And so I find it pretty shocking. And I'd say that combined with the world of fake news, make all of us thinking about the ethic of the future. We need to consider the non-rational tendencies within human decision making. And if we really want to tap into wisdom, to understand that people are affected by a lot more than pure rationality. Because if it were just reason, we would all get vaccinated.
So how many of you, if you went to a party and somebody turned on the news, would you leave the party? I think that's becoming quite a common thing, that if somebody does that, they just don't get the way one has fun. And listening to the news is just the pits, something maybe your grandparents do. So what about that? Do a lot of you regularly access the news somehow? Are you on top of what's happening in the world, either locally or nationally, internationally?
A little bit.
Do you feel any personal obligation? Like a lot of the things we talk about in this course, if you actually have no idea what's going on in the world, it'd be hard for you to gain much traction in helping the large causes, right? So it is. And your behavior influences the news, because people are trying to sell airtime. And if young people won't listen to the station again, if they have news for 5 minutes, because that wrecks your mood for weeks. So they contract the news to like a minute and a half, half a minute, to try to find some level of news that people actually find acceptable.
Well, I can understand your decision to not yet take a deep leap into the world of news as a means of sensible self-preservation.
Yeah.
At the same time, it probably is a nasty necessity if you really want to be able to put into context where we are in the world. This idea that we need to learn from history to understand the forces that push us in this direction or that direction. Very much what I think we hope to do with these ethics sessions in this class is to get you to think about things in a deeper way, to understand the omnipresence. There's always counter arguments and other possibilities. And in a sense, in a world where you've been told that a lot of the news is fake, by which they mean people writing it are not, or have a particular slant, to me the obvious antidote to that is to develop a more sophisticated consumer who's constantly asking themselves, where is this message coming from? What is their agenda? And when it comes to the technology of the future, the main question is this from somebody trying to sell me something, trying to increase their sales, or is it coming from a genuine place? And that, in some ways, is going to, a lot of the challenges of the future technologies and how they're introduced and then how they're implemented and spread, it will come down to that. Is it a marketing thing where somebody's just trying to sell as much as possible? Or is it, in some senses, a nobler cause where this good is being offered to you for some other reason? And I think one of the challenges of the world, where we're sort of fond of the market system, it's pretty good at delivering many goods and services, but I think we've got to figure out what types of human activities ought to be insulated from open markets. And I've said one thing about healthcare is it should be, because The customer in healthcare, if you're talking about a illness in a loved one, is not a rational consumer. They'll pay anything to have their loved one not die. And we in society, I think, need to protect people against being taken advantage of. So anyways, these are some of the things to consider. And then for the upcoming ones, we'll just be very, where I'm gonna lead the discussion about what some of the other people have said. We'll just make sure you're aware of which videos to watch, and we'll base our discussions on specific videos. Yes, thanks.